Hi everyone, this is Yuri from Data Forest, and today we have another amazing episode of our podcast, Empower the Data, where business begins with data and AI leads the way. And our today guest is an amazing guy. His name is Tommy Esposito. Tommy, first of all, thank you for finding the time and joining us. Say hello to our listeners.
Hello, all listeners.
Yay, that was short. So, for those who doesn't know, Tommy work is consultant and investment strategy specialist in the Kaufman Hall. And today we're going to have some conversation about his specific position, his company, and the data in general. So, Tommy, I'm not going to say a lot of you. So please introduce yourself to our listeners. Tell us a little bit more about who you are, what do you do specifically for the Kaufman Hall, and tell us a little bit more about the company by itself. So, and I'm shining up.
Okay, thank you, Yuri, for this opportunity to speak with you and your listeners.
Thank you.
As he said, my name's Tommy Esposito, and I work for Kaufman Hall. Kaufman Hall is a consulting firm that specializes in financial advisory for hospital systems across the United States. So we work with, hospital systems large and small, almost exclusively nonprofit hospital systems. So, just a quick FYI, about 85% of the hospitals in the United States are nonprofits. And it's for a reason. It's because hospitals uh, constantly struggle with making a profit. And that's because hospitals, think of it this way. Imagine running a business where you don't control the price of anything. You have to go and beg the payers, which are the private insurance companies or the government like Medicare, for money for the services that you provide patients who come in when they're sick. And at the same time, expenses are very difficult to control because there are limited numbers of doctors and nurses, and they're all highly in demand. And so there's been an immense amount of pressure on hospitals to just to keep afloat. And like any nonprofit, hospitals they tend to keep large balance sheets with excess reserves of cash in the years where they do have a little bit of profit, so that when they go through these periods where they have a lot of losses, like we're going through now, they can draw down those reserves to just keep everything going and continue to provide services in their communities. And what I do in my role is provide investment strategy help, investment advisory help for these hospitals and their assets to determine what is the liquidity need over the next 3 to 5 years. If you're going to lose money, can we do something about it? Maybe some performance improvements. And if we're going to need the balance sheet to increasingly support the hospital with cash, how do we do that and how do we plan for that? And what's the right asset mix to ensure that if there is a downturn in the stock market, making sure it all works? Hopefully this gives you an indication of the complexity of running a hospital and running its balance sheet. I think Peter Drucker, as a famous management guru, once was quoted saying that the hardest business to run in the United States is a hospital. And I have learned in my 3 years in this business that it's true. It's an incredibly complex organization. Any hospital is. They're very, very complicated. And my niche is I have this, prior to working at Kaufman Hall, to go a little bit more into my background, I've spent over 20 years working in banks, primarily in either finance roles, doing financial planning, like FP&A type stuff, but also risk management. So I have the unique privilege, I guess, or if you want to call it torture, of working in the credit risk capacity, doing loss forecasting for credit card portfolios, loan portfolios, commercial and residential, but also interest rate risk, and working in treasury teams where we're measuring, negative convexity in bond portfolios and things like that. So I just tend to have a lot of curiosity around banking, finance, balance sheets. And so that was why Kaufman Hall was attracted to me, because I'm able to help our hospital clients who are just trying to keep everything, all the balls in the air all the time, to ensure that they have financial safety and security. So, in short, I would say it's kind of like, think of it like this: everybody has a checking account, everybody has bills they have to pay every month, And you have to make sure you have adequate cash to cover your bills,
Yeah.
right? And then there's this excess amount that you keep putting away in your
That's called
401k,
taxes.
and that you have to have a strategy for that. And a strategy that, first, make sure you have enough cash, second, make sure that you're building something for the long term. If you ever want to buy a beach house, if you ever want to have a rental property or something like that, that comes into the long term planning. I'm helping hospitals do what I just described for individuals on a much grander scale. So hopefully that's helpful to your listeners to understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah, that's pretty complex. So, first of all, thank you for sharing. And that sounds pretty complex, pretty complicated, and pretty data-driven process.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Sure.
if we're talking about the data, what would you say, which role the data plays in your work, and
Mm-hmm.
how do you use it, and what kind of results you're getting from there?
Okay, great question. I would say data is absolutely critical, right? You can't manage what you can't measure, first of all. So you have to have a really solid understanding of where you are today financially, your balance sheet, your income statement. Then you have to work with your clients on what are your projections for future, right? And what are the assumptions that are driving your future? That's just the basic financial sort of approach. But then in terms of other data, which I think is really, really key and not really widely available, is peer data. So, like banks, like other businesses, you know, if Coke does something, Pepsi wants to do it too, right? So, what are my peers doing? And peer data is really, really key. So, we are able at Kaufman Hall to draw peer data from banks that work with hospitals like JP Morgan and others that publish publicly information about hospital systems and how they have positioned their assets. So that's a key data point. But primarily when you're working in markets and capital markets at all in general, you have to be constantly aware of what's happening in the market, right?
Mhm.
And as you know, Yuri, there's so much every day published
Oh yeah,
about the stock market. The
that's not
Dow,
easy to
the
filter that.
S&P went up 2%, down 2%, whatever, and there's just copious amounts of data about every single stock, every single company. And a lot of people, and this is where we can get into investment theories and things like that. But my overriding point here, Yuri, is that when it comes to data in markets, it's all about knowing how to cut through mostly noise to get to the signal, right? There's this guy we all know, Mr. Wonderful. You know, he always talks about, that Elon Musk
Mhm.
when is 100% signal, 0% noise, and that he actually personally had worked with him, and he said that Steve Jobs was something like 75% signal. And I think the point is that I want to make is there's signal and there's noise. Most of the news, like that, if you turn on CNBC or if you read the Wall Street Journal, a lot of it is noise. And it takes time and effort and experience to cut through the data that's streaming in like a fire hose and finding the really important information, right?
Mhm.
That's the difference now, I would say, versus say 20 or 30 years ago. 20 or 30 years ago, information was power, right? Few people had it, few people controlled all the information, and they were able to use it to get wealthy. Now, information is widely available to everyone with an internet connection. All you got to do is log in and you can get just about everything you want, especially with ChatGPT. I mean, you could just ask
Mhm.
ChatGPT anything you want. But the challenge now is how do I know and how do I develop expertise to understand what's really high value information versus what's just crap,
That's actually a
That's the
great
hard part.
question, and you asked it instead of me. So, if you already asked that question, tell us how to find the right information and how you do that. Is that just based on your experience, or that's something that you do by using some tools that helps you to sort it out?
I think it's trial and error. And I'm going to pivot to AI here a little bit. I'll give you an example that, I'm on the AI task force at Kaufman Hall. And one of the examples that I found that I was stunned by was there was an article at the beginning of this summer that was published by the Chicago Tribune, or pardon me, I think it was the Sun-Times, the Chicago Sun-Times. And the article was the top 10 summer reading books of 2025 summer, right? And then somebody checked it out and found that 9 of the 10 books were actually completely made up by AI, like the ChatGPT. So they tracked down the journalist that wrote it, who was a contract journalist, and he just didn't bother to double check what he got from ChatGPT. It was just completely made up. And it was published in not only in the Sun-Times, but all these regional newspapers had picked it up and published it. And they all had to publish a retraction apologizing that these books don't actually exist, right? So my point is, you gotta, like Ronald Reagan once said, trust but verify. You can use these AI tools as tools, but you've got to have a skeptical eye. So you have to have expertise too. The other thing I've found using these tools is if you're in an area where you really don't know what you're talking about. So if I were to go in and look up, say, brain surgery or, something I'm not at all an expert in, then I just start to accept blindly whatever it gives me. So I think it's important that you have an expertise either from your education or your work experience that you know what you're talking about when you start using these tools. Otherwise, you're going to have this problem like this journalist in Chicago
Oh yeah.
had. You're going to
Yeah,
get caught
definitely.
in
You can
trouble.
use it. Yeah, you can use AI as a co-pilot, but not a replacement for your own brain. Yeah, you have to use it. You have to work with that. But getting back to the question about some specific tools, I understand that sometimes we all use the chat GPT nowadays, or maybe some other uh, AI solutions. But do you use some specific tools that help you to analyze that maybe something like with the dashboards where you can track the result and what's happening in the market, or is that everything based just on your experience?
Well, for me, it's all about finding um, sources that you trust. So my formative experience in markets was living through 2008. I was in a treasury team in 2008 when everything went and hit the fan. In March of '08, you had Bear Stearns. In September, you had obviously Lehman Brothers.
That was a
And
bad time.
in that period, there was so much going on. And part of my job was to help us figure out why our bond portfolio was shrinking in value so quickly and what we could do about it. So I just basically just fire hosed my own education on what drives markets, and not only what drives markets but how government drives markets. And so in that time I began to identify sources of information that was very helpful for me to understand what's happening. And you find your experts. So I have a collection of these experts that I've built up over the years, and I'll give you guys a couple if you're interested. There's Zero Hedge. Zero Hedge is a website that is very popular amongst people who are traders, particularly in the bond markets, and bankers. It's vulgar though. There's a lot of vulgar commentary on there, but the data that they publish, typically from investment houses, and they've got incredible graphs and tables. They give you signals of things to look for. Another one is Christopher Whalen. Chris Whalen is they call him the Fed Whisperer. He publishes. He appears very often on news sites like CNBC, but he writes a blog. The Institutional Risk Analyst, I think it's called IRA, Institutional Risk Analyst. He's always got some interesting take on mortgages, on Fed policy. All of these are just two examples of many that I've collected over the years that I will go back to and check and say, what are these guys saying about, say, the Fed funds rate, right? The big question now everybody wants to know is, will the Fed lower the Fed funds rate, and what will that mean for mortgage rates and the U.S. economy and inflation? So you have to educate yourself slowly over time, and follow your muse, your interests, to get to a point where you feel strong, that you can develop a strong view on where the capital markets are headed. It takes a lifetime, I would say, when it comes to capital markets. It's just constantly evolving. And of course, the big story now, as I said, is what's the Fed going to do with Fed funds, but also how is AI going to impact not only markets but our lives, right?
Hmm.
And I'm not a tech savvy person. I mean, I use Excel. Excel has been my secret sauce since the day I started working. It was almost like a religion, right?
I think everybody
I
uses
love Excel,
it.
and I still do. I think Tableau is like they took what I used to do in Excel and they just dumbed it down and made it so that people wouldn't have to do what I did in Excel and just get the end product.
Just improve it. They just add some functionality there that
Yeah.
make it more comfortable for the big companies, and they're doing
Yeah, I
actually
mean
a great
it's
job
just
on that.
dumbed down, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like this if you're a coder, and coders will know this, and people who create things, you first have to create a process before you can automate it. You can't just cut right to automation. And that's what the problem I see with Tableau is. It's like they cut right to automation, but part of the creation process is exploring what data is there and then figuring out how to interpret it and present it. That still requires, in my mind, human intuition. So, I think that's what worries me about AI is, and I think we talked about this, Yuri, before the call, is this idea of, you know, intellectual laziness. People still need to follow their intuition and think through things. You can't just delegate that to a computer. You know,
100%.
they're not really going to do that. So anyway, we can take that conversation where you'd like, but I just wanted to make sure we hit that note in our time
Yeah,
together.
I totally agree about that. And thank you for sharing your point of view on this question. And I totally agree about some laziness. And a lot of people just start replacing their own brain with that. But the main thing that they don't understand that the answers they're getting from there based on some data and where that data came from. That's the question.
Yeah.
And as I always said, you cannot build the palace from the sticks. You need to have a good materials from that. And that's the
True.
reason why people need to have a good data to build some solutions, to make some conclusions on that. And if, let's say, you would be able to create some specific software of your dream, money is not objection, time is not objection, but something that would make your life easier and the life of Kaufman Hall easier, what would it be and why?
Oh man. You know, I think it would be something that would accelerate the process of turning data into information. And one of the ways that I've traditionally done that is honestly, I'm just going to talk about history here. I used to work with relational databases, and I would write SQL code or SAS code in another instance to access certain data about a pool of customers, right? And then I would drop it into Excel once I had it consolidated and condensed into certain subsets of categories of customer so that I could fit it into an Excel data set because it was, I think back then Excel, you could only fit like so many thousands of rows. And then I would put it in a pivot table and just play with the pivot table until I got the right data that I wanted about the customers and their behavior. And it could be anything. It could be payment history. It could be delinquency. They're not paying their bills. What are the things about people who aren't paying their bills that I can discover, right? So what I'm thinking about here is that's a long and laborious process. And if you could find, if software could help me accelerate that process, then in a way that's truly intuitive and not just give me the answer. I would want to have the chance to go in and mess with it and see if I can get to this to the answer I'm looking for. If there's a way to do that with a query or with a prompt
Mhm.
and pointing it to data sets and saying, can you help me with this and that and this? That would be interesting to me. I hope it's a bit of a ramble, but
Listen, there's something that can make your life easier. It doesn't mean that a lot of people have to understand that. That's specific solution for your specific role.
yeah. And then the other thing I would say is like, and maybe this is where, on the banking side, because I have a lot of prior experience with banking, a lot of bankers are worried about their deposits. When the Fed funds rate starts to come down, bankers typically will react by lowering their deposit rate, right? So if the Fed funds is at 4.5 and your deposit rate's at 3.5, if the Fed funds drops 25 basis points, typically a bank will lower their deposit rate. And there's all this concern about people, taking their money out of the bank and putting it in a money market or something else. Being able to use a tool to help understand the trade-offs of these changes in rates and how it impacts profitability. A lot of that is done now with a back of the envelope analysis or instinct or intuition, which is important. As I said, human intuition is important. But if we can use some of this, historical data to help track those decisions and maybe apply some AI analysis to it, that might give a bank that can apply it a leg up,
Yep.
Similar to, say, the way, and again, I'm just thinking about this sort of from an algorithm standpoint, but airlines use complicated systems to price their tickets on flights. As anyone who, like myself, who's had to buy a flight, buy a plane ticket right before the flight, the prices vary widely right up until the end, and they use these complicated algorithms to do it, and they tend to overbook flights. And they've got all this science around it, and math and etc. Physics even.
They ask some people to leave that flight and offer
Yeah,
them some
and people
gift cards for that.
exactly.
I've been through that.
So that's the kind of thing I think it could be helpful. And again, I apologize for not giving you something super duper specific, but that's something that pops up into
We're not
mind.
trying to
And
develop
I
any.
think the final thing I would say, and again, if any of your listeners is in the healthcare world, one huge, massive opportunity that I'll call out is that as I mentioned earlier with hospitals, when somebody comes in and needs a surgery or whatever treatment, and somewhere along the line, a nurse has to go to a computer and type in these codes for the services provided, right? And it's a very manual process. And often these billings get rejected. And, only 85 to 90% of the billings that are submitted actually get paid. There's this huge gap. I mean, that's a massive gap, 10% or more. In some hospitals, it's even greater, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we could apply AI to help us figure out how to do this billing stuff in a way that you get up closer to 90, 95% reconciliation of billings, it would be really great for hospitals.
With
So,
$5 trillion that US spends on healthcare, 5%, that's something that's pretty massive, I would say.
yeah. And so what happens is insurance companies, they get to keep that money rather than pay the hospitals for the services that the hospitals provided, all because of this Byzantine system of hundreds, thousands of codes for all the different types of care. And the other thing I would say is it would improve the efficiency of hospitals. So data that Kaufman Hall publishes suggests that something like 40 to 50% of time for some doctors and nurses is spent on paperwork. Imagine if you could cut that down to, say, 25% with a better system. Then you have more time for care, more time for serving patients, and less time on, boring paperwork.
Yeah, I mean,
That would be a really awesome opportunity for AI to help us
that's
fix.
great to use some AI note taker there. I mean, when you're just saying something, it just goes direct to the document, and you can save a lot of time on that.
Yeah,
I've been
no, for
through this
sure.
process, and I know how much time that takes, and that's actually annoying and really ridiculous, I would say. Like when you
So if
plan.
there's an entrepreneur listening, please take a swing at it, because not only will you be helping your fellow man and woman who's sick get the treatment they need, but you'll also be helping hospitals who are, struggling to make ends meet in these times. So anyway,
Just
yeah.
really start talking about that. So if let's say you would recommend some solution for hospitals, is that would be something that can automate the paperwork, or that's going to be something that can predict some results, or maybe calculate something? What would it be?
I think the biggest, as I said, the biggest challenge or the biggest opportunity would be to help systems with their billings. Yeah. I mean, the billing process is very manual. Medicare basically sets the billings system, in the categories, and they update it regularly. So, every month or two, there's a new approved process for a heart valve or something. They will add a new category into their billing system because healthcare is constantly evolving, right? So that's why I think something where technology like AI could really help is it moves so quickly. You need something that can react. Otherwise, it's done manually in this very laborious way. And, you know, a lot of times billings get rejected because a nurse goes in and there's maybe 20 different ways to do an appendix billing or whatever, 8 different ways. And they put the wrong one in. It's maybe number 8, not number 7, which they put in. And then it gets rejected. So stuff like that. And again, I'm getting into the weeds here, but I'm just trying to offer some thoughts here,
Yeah. So again, thank you for sharing. That's really interesting. I mean, you know this from the inside, and any insights are very welcome here for our listeners and us too. And if, let's say, we're talking about AI, not nowadays, but I don't know, I would say in 5 years. Tell me, where do you see this for
Mm.
yourself and for the company like you work in and the companies like yours? Is that going to replace people? I'm not saying like you, but maybe some employees there, or that's just going to be still a co-pilot that helps people to save some time on some routine daily work, or what that's going to be?
That's a great question. And I am a student of history. My undergraduate major was history. And I think you got to go back in time to contextualize the impact of this new technology. And I'll give you a couple of examples of transformative technologies that were implemented. Let's go back to like 1900, right? When everybody was riding around on horses, right? And then all of a sudden somebody invented the internal combustion engine, and then Henry Ford invented mass production of cars. And so the horse became less relevant. The farrier, the guy who puts the horseshoes on a horse, didn't need as many farriers anymore. And so all the farriers were worried about, what am I going to do? How am I going to find work? I'm a farrier. So that happened, and it made everyone's life better because everybody could be more mobile. It expanded all of the travel that Americans could do. It changed the way we conducted business, right? Because we didn't need trains as much anymore to get from Philly to New York. We could get in our car, right? So life changed for the better, I would say, on the whole. Okay. You could also use the example of what happened with computers, right? Steve Jobs invented the Mac. Then you had Microsoft with Windows, and all the people there were in every company. You had the whole warehouses full of paperwork and files, right? Paper for everything. All of that it was all these people doing that paperwork, right? They didn't have a job anymore because it was all digitized, right? And you just look what I did in Excel as a young man. I mean, imagine the number of people that it was required to create a financial forecast.
Oh yeah,
I built a 3-year forecast in Excel by month with a balance sheet, income statement, and cash flow in a single Excel file for a $90 billion bank, right?
and our AI can do this in a minute.
Yeah. So, but I mean, before that, 10 years before I did it, you'd need a whole army of people, right, to do that. And you'd need all this paperwork, and you'd have to know and have a filing system and all this. Like, all of that went away with this new technology. So, to me, what AI represents is similar to what happened with what Microsoft did in the 80s, to office systems and processes, what the automobile did, what nuclear power did in the 50s. It's transformative. It's going to change our lives. And what we have to ensure is that it changes our lives for the better. And that's everyone's responsibility, right? We all have to advocate for what we want. But to treat it with fear, I think is I don't see it being this existential threat that we hear about. I think that a lot of people think about the movies that we saw when we were younger,
Oh
movies
yeah.
like the Matrix or Terminator 2. But I tend to think it's more Star Trek: The Next Generation. Call me an optimist, but I
Probably you
think,
watched Iron Man with the Jarvis.
yeah, Iron Man, another one. We have to fight to make it better for us. And the other thing I would say is I think a lot of on a business and job and employment note, I think that a lot of big corporations are beginning to realize they don't need to be as big as they have been in terms of headcount. They're starting to see and think about how to use these systems to reduce their headcount, right? So, the big corporation where you would go and stay in a job for 20 years or 30 years, that no longer exists. It hasn't existed for a long time. So I think people definitely need to think more of in an entrepreneurial way about their careers, where maybe you work in a big company for a while, but maybe part of your career you use AI to help you develop a new system, a new job offering that you can offer to businesses. And America is built on entrepreneurship. So I think this is going to inculcate greater entrepreneurial insights, investments, and opportunities as people continue to innovate with these tools. So I'm optimistic. I think it's going to make, as long as people take it the right way, and as long as that AI 2027 paper doesn't come true, where it's China versus the U.S. and then like another nuclear arms race thing, hopefully we can make peace with the Chinese, and everybody gets along, and let us continue to progress as people. I think we will. I'm optimistic.
Oh,
So
yeah. So that sounds really good, and I like that you look at this from the optimistic side. I do the same, and yeah, I'm pretty sure that the way how that's gonna work in the future, based on us and the companies who can build that. So if you guys don't know where to build some AI solution for you or integrate it, just come to Data Forest. We can help you with that. And if you doesn't know how to work with the bills, please go to Kaufman Hall. Ask Tommy. He will tell you all he knows, and he has a lot of expertise in this question, especially in the healthcare sector. So, guys, that's the person that you need to talk to. And
and
because
banks, don't forget. I know a lot about American banks as
oh,
well. Worked in them for
oh yeah,
20 some years. So
sorry, I forgot about that. So yeah, thank you for clarification. And on this positive note, like we slowly but surely are running out of time. So I always ask the one thing in the end from our guests. Tommy, if you would say something for our listeners now, some final statement of this conversation, what would it be?
I would say, I'll reiterate something I kind of touched on earlier. The biggest challenge, particularly for the young people, with utilizing AI in your lives is avoiding intellectual laziness. And let me give you a specific example. So let's say you have to write a paper, right, for your history class. And, what you want to do is learn how to do it. You don't want to just go into ChatGPT and say, write me a history paper that's 5 pages long that covers this, that, and this, and that, and this. And then boom, it's done, right? Just like if you ever seen the movie Back to School, I know it's a bit of a reference, but Back to School, Rodney Dangerfield, he's an older guy, wealthy man who goes to college to help his son who's in this college and not doing well. And one of the things he does is his son tells him he has to write a paper for Kurt Vonnegut, right?
Mhm.
This famous American writer, Kurt Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse-Five, and so on. So Rodney Dangerfield calls Kurt Vonnegut and says, I will pay you to write me a paper for my son. He gets Vonnegut to write it. He hands it to his son, and the son looks at it and says, I don't want this. I want to write that paper, right? So you have to be intellectually curious. You have to say, I want to write that paper. You can't just go into ChatGPT, because if you do, your brain will stop working, right? It won't. The greatest tool on the entire planet Earth is the human mind, right? There is no greater, more powerful tool on Earth than the human mind. And we have to continue to cultivate that mind. If we don't, we're going to go back to being monkeys. So let's all say, okay, I'll use ChatGPT as a tool on my tool belt, like a knife or a hammer or a Phillips head screwdriver, but not as my brain, right? So that's what I'll leave, particularly the younger listeners. That's what I'll leave you with.
All right. So, Tommy, thank you for that. Thank you for the statement. I agree about that. So, guys, just use the AI to make your life easier, but not make your brain dumber. And
Yeah.
this positive notes, thank you for being with us. Very soon, we're going to come back with another guest for another podcast of Empower the Data. So, Tommy, thank you so much. Stay safe, stay cool, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Yuri. It's been a pleasure.
For me too. Ciao for now and see you next time.